Welcome to the Play Podcast with me, Douglas Schatz. Hello, and welcome to episode 42 of the Play Podcast, where we explore the greatest new and classic plays. I'm Douglas Schatz, founder and host of the Play Podcast. A word of warning before we start. This play, and therefore this episode, are not for the faint-hearted. Our conversation about the play will contain language and scenes that may be disturbing. The curtain rises on a very expensive hotel room in Leeds, the kind that is so expensive it could be anywhere in the world. There is a large double bed, a minibar, champagne on ice, and a large bouquet of flowers. Two people enter. Ian, 45, Welsh-born but has lived in Leeds most of his life, and Kate, 21, a lower middle-class southerner with a South London accent. Ian goes straight to the minibar and pours himself a large gin. He turns to survey the room. I've shat in better places than this. Contrary to first appearances, this may not be a romantic comedy after all. In fact, what is to follow is one of the most disturbing plays of the past 50 years, with scenes of rape, suicide, blinding, and cannibalism, as well as graphic sex and descriptions of atrocities of war. The play is Blasted by Sarah Kane, and it was greeted by shock and outrage by critics when it premiered in the small upstairs theatre at the Royal Court in 1995, gaining its 23-year-old author unexpected and unwelcome tabloid notoriety. Kane wrote only 4 more plays in her short life, all of which are challenging in form and content, featuring extremes of sex and violence, love and cruelty, but also a raw honesty and even glimmers of hope and beauty. In the little more than 2 decades since she took her own life in 1999 at the age of 28, Kane's reputation has been defined partly in terms of the myth of the tortured artist. But her work has also found a singular place in the critical canon, distinctive and influential for its innovative form and its brutal vision. I'm joined today by someone who's very well qualified to guide us through the blasted landscape of Sarah Kane's play. Graham Saunders is the author of Love Me or Kill Me, Sarah Kane and the Theatre of Extremes, published by Manchester University Press, as well as About Kane, the Playwright and the Work, published by Faber, and the editor of Sarah Kane in Context, also for Manchester University Press. He has written a number of other books on modern British drama, and in his day job, Graham is professor of drama at the University of Birmingham. Welcome, Graham. Thanks for joining me to talk about Sarah Kane and Blasted today.
Thank you, Douglas. Thank you.
You obviously have a fascination for the work of Sarah Kane, so I'm interested to know where and when you first encountered Blasted and her plays, and what is it about her work that drew you to it?
Well, I first encountered Blasted before it became Blasted, in effect. Sarah Kane did an MA at the University of Birmingham, which was run by the playwright David Edgar. This was in 1993. What happened with the MAs was that an extract from each of the plays would be performed in front of a group of agents. And so Blasted was the last play on Saturday. We'd heard already that this play was controversial, that there were issues of nudity and violence. And when I went to actually see the play itself, it caused a stir even then. And at the end of each segment, the playwright David Edgar took the unfortunate playwright out for questions from the audience. And already there were those who were castigating the play and saying it was nonsense. Poor Sarah Kane was having to defend it. Anyway, after that, I stayed on at the university to do my PhD, which was looking at how contemporary British dramatists rewrite Shakespeare and his contemporaries. By that time, I'd seen Blasted at the Royal Court, and I was already working on my PhD, and it struck me then that this had connections with Shakespeare's King Lear, with the issues of blinding. There's a scene where Kate unloads Ian's gun, and it looks as though she's going to help him commit suicide, but she doesn't. Similarities with Edgar taking Gloucester up to the edge of Dover Cliff.
Yeah.
Making him appear as though he's committed suicide, but he hasn't. So there was all this running through my mind. So I managed to arrange an interview with Sarah Kane. So I went down to where she was living at the time, Brixton in London, and interviewed her about Blasted in relation to King Lear. And so that started a sort of relationship that lasted until her death, where we would correspond, we occasionally met. By the time I'd finished the PhD, I wanted to write about Sarah Kane. Then she committed suicide in February of 99. But it took a long time actually to get people to talk about her work, because of course, quite rightly, people suspect someone's motives for something, a book coming out immediately after a playwright has died. So yeah, that's that in my rather convoluted way is how I got interested in her work. And then during that time, I saw every other subsequent play that she did. So I'd been following her career quite closely after Birmingham.
It's fantastic that you had such early personal contact with this play, being, as you said, at the workshop version in Birmingham and then talking to her about the play. Few have had that opportunity, I'm sure. And it's interesting you're saying about suspicion about academic analysis of the play and things, a bit like Carol Churchill, I think, in some ways as well, in that to some degree, I think certain types of playwright and those who are working with and around her prefer the work to speak for itself.
Yes.
But I wanted to ask you, where did it come from in her life, Blasted? I mean, as I understand it, as you just described, it was essentially her first full-length play, right? So how did this come about and how does it fit into the rest of her career?
She's interesting that she talks about the genesis of the play in the interview I did with her, that it seems to come out of two things. That she starts off by writing a play about a physically and sexually abusive domestic relationship.
Yeah.
And then the war in the former Yugoslavia occurs, particularly the siege of Srebrenica. So these two things are sort of mixing away together. And so she sort of makes that connection between domestic, physical and sexual abuse between Ian and Kate, and then widens it to acts of war atrocity. So this is why you get the hotel room in Leeds suddenly becoming transplanted into a war zone somewhere else. So it's those two things, I think, that seem to be sort of connecting. And I suppose what you were saying about where does Blasted connect with her other work? There is, in almost all of her plays, an abusive relationship to some extent, often based on a sexualization. And also in her plays, there's often a male abuser and a masochistic female recipient of that. And often it is a masochistic relationship.
So where did this come from her? Why this particular focus or fascination? Was this personal? Do you know that?
I don't know. I have no idea. No.
Okay.
And I think it would be specious to speculate about that.
Sure.
But certainly it's there in fact, it is there in all the plays. So this idea of mutual codependency, I think, is there in almost all of the work.
Well, we'll come and talk about that relationship with Ian and Kate in more detail, of course. Actually, I wanted to ask you in terms of the sources as well, or the type of theater I think that she wanted to write. I read in one of your books that there was an experience she had at Edinburgh Festival with a devised piece of theater called Mad by Jeremy Weller's Grassmarket Project. And this had a significant influence on her views about the type of theater that she wanted to write, which is partly where the form and the subject matter of Blasted, I think, come from, is it not? Tell us a little bit about what that experience was and influence on her.
Yeah, I think it was profound that Jeremy Weller set up this piece called Mad, in which people who had had direct experience of mental illness were invited to devise a performance based around it. And what struck Kane from the performance was how raw it was. It was difficult to know whether the actors were acting or whether they were actually experiencing genuine mental distress. And so that demarcation between the real and the unreal on stage is something that really set her thinking. And in some ways, I think sets her drama apart from a lot of other plays that were going on at the time and subsequent.
Yeah, it's hard to, when you see it or even read it and hear from actors who take part in it, it's very challenging to be part of one of these plays. So as you say, the lines between artificiality and reality are blurred. But the other thing was, you talked about it, I think, in style as being an experiential theater. It's a sort of visceral, emotional reaction on the part of an audience, as opposed to it being an intellectual exercise. It's, you're put into a place as the audience of extreme discomfort and distress even. It's painful to be part of. And I think she found that very compelling and said as much, that she wanted to make theater like that, experiential theater.
Yeah, which is something that we go back to someone like Artaud is saying exactly the same thing in theatre, and that it's double. And it's also something that Alex Sears uses as part of his criteria for his term in-your-face theatre. That period from the mid to late 90s, with which he puts Sarah Kane at the centre of. And that attempt, he thinks, of trying to get the audience to experience something emotionally rather than intellectually. The intellectual analysis comes later. And I certainly think that's true with Kane.
I was thinking about the association with the Edinburgh Festival as well, where you have experiences in the theater which are up close and personal in some ways, because you're often in small spaces, for example, and the work can be quite innovative. In fact, I remember one particular experience, it's slightly divergent, but up in Edinburgh, where the play was performed in a narrow, damp brick corridor in the basement of one of the venues. And we were just sort of crammed in, standing in this narrow corridor. And it was about World War I. And there was a soldier who, throughout the piece, he would grab handfuls of wet red liver out of a bucket and throw them at the wall in front of him, the brick wall in front of them. And they were virtually splashing on us, these pieces of liver. And he repeats this wordlessly a number of times during the play. I have to say, I can't recall a single word of what was spoken or what that play was about, other than that image and that experience, which was, of course, was incredibly immediate and vivid to experience, as we've just been describing. And we've been talking quite a lot about how Sarah Kane came to this, and a bit about the type of theater she's interested in. I think it would help very much, Graham, if for our listeners, if we would tell them a bit about what happens in the play. What is it that's so shocking about this? Give them an idea of what happens in terms of plot.
Well, it begins, as you say, in a hotel room in Leeds, and it does seem as if we're going to be prepared for a romantic comedy, a sort of Neil Simon-like comedy. You've got a bed, you've got champagne on ice. Two figures enter: Ian, a much older man, and Kate, a younger woman. Right from the start, some of the stage directions are odd, that he's Welsh born but has a Yorkshire accent and identifies as English. We learned that they had been in a relationship before, with the inference that Kate was much younger, possibly even below the age of consent. There is certainly that implication. She's come back to this hotel room somewhat naively to spend the weekend with Ian because she feels sorry for him. He's brought her back quite clearly for the purposes of seduction, of reigniting a sexual relationship. Kate has subsequently got another boyfriend. We learn that Ian's wife has left him and he's estranged from his son. We also learn he's a journalist, and during the course of the play, he recounts a long story using sort of journalese to report the story on a phone about a young backpacker in Australia who has been murdered. The play begins with Ian attempting to seduce Kate, and he tricks her into masturbating him. We also learn that Kate has learning difficulties, but she also has a series of petit mal fits in which she goes into a trance-like state, and she describes it as going into another place. Now, these fits are important, I think, because they set up the realistic first part of the play and then the second part of the play. During one of those trance-like states, Ian sexually assaults her. We also learn that Kate is a vegetarian. This is also an important part of the play later on. The early scenes of the play also demonstrate Ian's racism, his xenophobia, and he also seems to belong to some sort of right-wing organization, possibly a terrorist organization that is associated with hate crime of one sort or another. We learn that he's also dying of lung cancer. He recounts about seeing one of his lungs having been removed by a surgeon and describes it as a lump of rotting pork. During the night, Ian assaults Kate again, even though she shares the room with him. He rapes her during the night. And then we see the next morning and her anger at him. She rips his leather jacket. Kate as well expresses in the first part of the play a sort of a simple Christian faith and asks Ian at one point whether he believes in the afterlife. There's then this strange moment where after the sexual assault, Kate wants to leave and catch the next train out of Leeds. He tries to persuade her to stay. She escapes, however, out of the bathroom window, at which point there is a series of knocks on the door. Ian goes to answer it, and suddenly a soldier is outside. The soldier has a rifle. He threatens Ian with the gun. We suddenly realize that we are not in Leeds anymore. Something very odd has happened. At which point a mortar bomb hits the hotel room, and the soldier and Ian are rendered unconscious. Both recover, and the soldier then recounts a long story about the rape and murder of his girlfriend, Col. And the soldier also recounts atrocities that he has committed. The soldier then sort of imagines Ian as Col, and he reenacts the rape that she underwent by a series of other soldiers, and also the fact they blinded her. So he rapes Ian and he sucks his eyes out. Ian is rendered blind, and the soldier immediately after that commits suicide. So it's almost as if he's connected with her, and to understand what she went through, he kills himself. Whole seasons pass. We get this strange stage direction of the sound of spring rain, summer rain, winter rain. Ian then undergoes what can only be described as a sort of dark night of the soul. He undergoes a series of activities that include strangling himself, masturbating. Kate, in the meanwhile, has come back with a baby that she's found in a war zone. It looks as though she has also been raped. There is a stage direction that blood is seeping down her legs. It then culminates with Ian eating the baby. So time basically has speeded up. Ian, blinded, then sits in the child's grave and then dies with relief. But then we realize that he's also resurrected, comes back to life, at which point Kate comes back with some food that she bartered from soldiers, and she feeds Ian at the end. And the play ends with Ian's final lines, "Thank you." So that's a very brief description of the play.
Well done. Well, I think you've done pretty well. You've covered almost everything, I think, in key events. Listeners will realize from the number of things you've just described that there's a lot of disturbing events that go on and are described in this play. Starting with the fact that just initially, it seems hard enough that Ian himself is a deeply unpleasant character. He's emotionally and physically abusive to Kate, and he's racist and homophobic, as you described. So all of that's unpleasant enough in the way he abuses her sexually. But it goes from there to worse in some respects, with the soldier coming in and it becoming, as you say, a war zone. And we're not sure where we are really now. We're wondering whether the battle's going on outside in the streets of Leeds or where we are. It's non-specific at that point. But of course, even more grotesque things occur and are described, as you just outlined. It's clear that there's enough in this that you can see why some people had an extreme reaction to it at its premiere. I wondered if you could just tell us a bit more about what the flavor of the response was initially by the critics in the reviews. Were they universally critic, and what was it they had to say?
It was pretty much universally vitriolic. It was described by Jack Tinker as this disgusting feast of filth. It was described by Nick Curtis in the Evening Standard as like having your head rammed into an overflowing ashtray. She was castigated for being naive, for writing nothing but a series of atrocities. Her age and gender were used against her, that she was seen as this young female dramatist, 23, who didn't really know what she was writing. The play was also castigated that it didn't make sense. I mean, there were one or two reviews that guardedly said that there was something here, but pretty much it was universally castigated, even to the point of becoming a newspaper item. In the Daily Express, I think it was, there was a headline, "Rape Girl Goes into Hiding."
Wow.
It became an item on Newsnight. Stephen Daldry, who was director of the Royal Court, came back from New York and defended the play. And of course, there was always the usual British thing about anything to do with the arts of public subsidy being used to write this. Jeremy Paxman, I think, on Newsnight's opening lines was, "Why is the Royal Court funding such filth?" was his opening provocative question. So it did have also defenders. Edward Bond wrote a really interesting piece for The Guardian called A Blast at Our Smug Theatre, where he was right on the money. He'd seen the play and he could see the parallels about what it was trying to do. And also people like David Gregg and Harold Pinter defended it. So it had a terrible, terrible opening review.
Yeah, it's extraordinary, isn't it? Because it's a very small theater. Very small numbers of people will have actually seen it.
Yeah.
It's one of those moments in a way, which is partly why we still talk about Kane, but also, of course, the work has endured for other reasons, which we'll talk about. But, those moments like Beckett or Look Back in Anger, she's doing something new, pushing the boundaries, and that makes people uncomfortable. It's funny, she said something about the fact that she realized that all of the critics in the audience were generally white middle-aged men, of course, and she realized that the main character in her play was a middle-aged journalist who rapes his girlfriend and is then raped himself. So maybe they were feeling very uneasy in their seats. And as you say, as David Gregg said, Blasted will last. It's a very good play indeed. And after the hysteria dies down, it remains to be read and performed for years to come. So a few champions, but not many. I wanted to ask you, one of the things I think that discomforted them was obviously a lot about the content, but also about the form of the play. Kane herself said the best art is subversive in form and content. And I wanted to ask you why this form of this play is subversive, and why does she structure it that way?
Well, it comes back to what I think she was saying about this idea of acts of warfare, acts of sort of national horror or atrocity having their roots in domestic violence. And she talks about the one being the seed and one being the tree, if you like. And so that idea of the relationship between domestic abuse in a Leeds hotel room leading to acts of war in which the events are magnified by many, many hundreds of times. So she uses that and also the conduit of Kate's fits as well to sort of take us into this other realm. So it's really that, I think, that connects the first part. And I think this is one of the other things that wrong-footed the critics, because it starts off, you think you know where you are with this play. It's about an abusive relationship, but then it becomes something very, very different. And suddenly you are thrown. And also the fact that the acts of violence occur again and again and again and again in such repetition. So you are bombarded. And I think, to be fair, perhaps, to the critics, when you go and see that play for the first time, I'd had the advantage, I guess, of reading the whole play beforehand. So I knew what was going to happen. If you'd gone to see that for the first time, it would have been confusing. It's still difficult. So, for example, you're never sure whether Ian has died and come back to life.
Yeah.
It has water dripping down on his head, but I would defy a director, I've never seen a director yet, who's managed to make that absolutely apparent that he's died and resurrected. So Blasted on a first viewing was very challenging.
Yes. So as you say, it's challenging in the sense of those repetitious acts of violence that don't give you any room to settle, to relax at all, of course. And she said that it's very concentrated. She said actually that none of these things are made up. All these things happen, as we know, but it's just very concentrated, of course. But in terms of that form and that structure, I think the key thing, as you describe, is that it changes so abruptly.
Yes.
And significantly, right? So the first half is relatively naturalistic, social realism, naturalistic time and space and dialogue. But the unities of time and place are exploded, literally exploded, because there's a bomb goes off. And in fact, the set is opened up. The wall of the hotel rooms opens up and the soldier comes from we don't know where. So, again, the unity of place in that sense is disturbed. We don't know where we are. Are we still in Leeds? And she doesn't particularly mention Bosnia and Srebrenica. She does never specifically refer to being a war in Bosnia or anywhere. This civil war, and we think it's a civil war because it's uncertain whether Ian's even part of this, but the soldier seems to be in a civil war. He says that at one point, I think it's our country now. It's somehow that's an internal fight. We think this could be going on in the streets of Britain or not, but it obviously deliberately confuses in the form that she presents it.
It's interesting that in the early drafts of the play, before it was published, the references to Bosnia are made explicit. So the soldier is actually called Vladek, and he talks about foreign involvement in Bosnia. It's interesting that that's completely removed in subsequent drafts. so that he becomes universal.
Yes, exactly. It becomes universal, doesn't it? And even particularly, you could then assume it is happening here. I think the importance of that is that it disturbs our complacency, that it's not possible for these things to happen here or for us to behave like that. And of course, her message is very much, it certainly is. Look,
yes,
these are people behaving like that in the hotel room. We can equally behave like that in a war zone or to each other in other ways. And actually, I was also going to say that I thought that the form of the play, the way that it disrupts is in a sense a reflection or an expression of the disorientation when society's blown up and war is going on, or even personally, the disorientation that these characters feel. The fragility of their lives and of society is mirrored by the breakdown in the order of the play, in a sense, in the form of the play. Does that make sense?
It does, yes. And also the sort of the senselessness of what's going on.
Yes.
And whether at one point Ian says, well, is this real? And the soldier says, yes, this is more real than real. The fact that there isn't a logic to the second part of the play. It doesn't seem to have a logic. And I guess that might have been what she was trying to achieve in sort of showing that war has that series of illogical acts. It doesn't seem to have any sense to it. There's no sense of who is fighting who in this play, and that's, I think, deliberate.
Yes, you just reminded me about that randomness of war. But as well, of course, what we get more specifically is the behavior of the soldiers, and this soldier in particular, and how brutal it is in raping, mutilating as they go, and seeming to think that that's allowed. There's something about them being unconstrained. The normal rules don't apply, right? Isn't the suggestion is that if I'm sanctioned to be able to kill, what's the difference? I mean, who's going to call me on other crimes like rape?
But then, strangely, the soldier wants Ian to report on it. The soldier's an odd character because he's oddly sympathetic. That, yes, he tells Ian that he has raped a 12-year-old girl, but in the same sense, he is grieving for his girlfriend. And he's the first of Kane's characters who commits suicide. Every one of her plays always contains someone who either commits suicide or attempts to. He also emerges as a strangely sympathetic figure as well. So you never quite know. I mean, even Ian, this monstrous figure at the end with that final thank you, emerges as somehow quite fragile. And despite the terrible things he's done, there is a sense of redemption there, possibly.
You're absolutely right. I think initially these characters you think could be fairly simply drawn, but they're not as simple as they first appear, any of them. So the soldier, for example, as you said, it's an extraordinary device in a way, the way he just bursts into the play, into the room and into the play. And as you said at the very beginning, I think she had started writing something about this personal relationship and then wanted to expand it and use this device to do so. And it disrupts the form, as we said, but also brings this character in. And he has this explosive energy, doesn't he? He's incredibly dominating. Ian's living in fear of him. He totally dominates Ian. And he has literally walked in from a war zone where, the constraints no longer apply. So we are fearful of what may happen and what he's capable of, certainly. But on the other hand, as you've just described, he also brings with him the trauma of someone who's been through the hell of war, doesn't he? So there is this real suffering that you witness. He is obviously deeply grieving what happened to his girlfriend and what's happened to him. Isn't he grieving what's happened to himself?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. You mentioned that word trauma, and there is a fantastic chapter in a book by a guy called Peter Boos called Theory and Drama, where he reads Blasted as a play about trauma. And I think he's absolutely right that all of the characters in this play, either before the play has begun or during the play, they are living through trauma or are about to experience it in some way. And I think that's true of all of the characters.
It's interesting because he becomes a testimony against war in a way, doesn't it? About what war does to soldiers, that he can commit these acts. And as he confesses, he participated in these acts of gross brutality. But he says they're all like that. All soldiers are like that. There's no choice but to join in and be like that in this context. And he even has Weirdly, he even has some sympathy for the soldier who rapes and kills his girlfriend. I mean, not directly, but he calls him a poor bastard, the soldier, as if, he's a victim of the same kind of trauma that he is, that they're all victimized by being put into this position and are acting and been brutalized against their will almost.
Yeah, and he relives the trauma by enacting it upon Ian, who in turn had enacted that upon Kate earlier in the play. So it's a chain. There's a strange moment as well. I mean, it's almost humorous, where the soldier and Ian engage in a game of one-upmanship on who's killed someone. The soldier doesn't believe that Ian's actually ever killed anybody because Ian's done it too cleanly and neatly. He says, well, you haven't killed anyone.
It's hard to know what Ian is, though, isn't it? Has he really or not? Kate has some doubt about how tough he really is. She accuses him of being soft and incapable of doing that. And his story about being part of this, I don't know, paramilitary group, or else even the government, maybe he's from the Secret Service, or what he is he making all this up? And he displays these signs of paranoia and persecution in the first part of the play. He's very jumpy every time someone knocks on the door or something like that. Then he thinks someone's coming for him. He has a gun. He's protecting himself. He's a journalist. Why has he got a gun? And of course, then the soldier seems to know who he is. Is he chasing him? Is he his past coming to? We don't know these things really. But what's interesting is the character of Ian himself. So initially, we think he's nothing but horrible. He is horrific to Kate. And yet, as the play goes on, he becomes more and more vulnerable, doesn't he? And we actually do have some pity for him, don't we?
Yes. One academic, Elaine Aston, argues that Ian becomes feminized through undergoing sodomy. But, he's also someone who doesn't really know himself. As I say, he's Welsh, but he identifies with being English. So this is someone who doesn't seem to have any sense of identity, and also rather pathetically wants Kate back to him like a child. When she says that she's got another boyfriend, well, he acts like a sort of overgrown teenager, was saying, "You're more mine than his. You belong to me."
I was going to ask you, what is that relationship about? Because he abuses her and he's cruel to her, but he says repeatedly that he loves her.
Yes,
and he wants her back. And there are moments where he's almost solicitous to her. So what is going on there between them?
Well, it's strange how this play from 1995 is suddenly rendered again contemporary. The whole issue of toxic masculinity, of controlling relationships. I mean, it's the epitome, isn't it, of a controlling relationship.
It is, yes.
He's abusive to her. He's insulting. He talks about her being stupid. She'll never get a job. And then he'll say that line, "But I love you." So all of those sort of points of trying to control, coerce, and manipulate, they're all there in that first part of the play. And one thing we've not spoken about is whether the second part of the play is actually real. You could argue that this is actually a nightmare. This is actually, the soldier is something from Ian's id. It's something that has come back to punish him, or Kate in a form of coming back to punish him.
I think Kane actually might have been asked, you'll know this better than I, might have been asked about some directors treat the second half more as dreamlike, because of course the unities, as we said earlier, of time and the location start to blur. But I think she resisted that interpretation, saying, no, this is real.
Yes, she argues that in a production, the second part should feel more real than the first part. Again, very difficult to achieve, I would imagine.
Yes. Well, yes, we haven't talked a lot about the challenges of staging, but I wanted to say about Kate, actually, when you talked about the abuse she suffers from Ian and in that relationship, why does she come back? You talked earlier about the masochism, but let's talk a little bit about her character. I mean, clearly there's some suggestion that she's pretty naive, immature. She's very young. She's 21, I think we said at the beginning when this starts. And this relationship started some years previously. So as you say, a teenager and potentially underage. Initially, you think she's not very smart. She seems vulnerable to exploitation and somewhat damaged herself. She stutters when under pressure. She has these fits, as you say. This is a very vulnerable young girl. And there are some indications, aren't there, that she's not had an easy life, that maybe this is part of the reason that she might be with Ian, is that she's running away from something?
Yeah, again, one of the things about her stagecraft and the way that she economically uses dialogue to actually say a great deal. She says that her fits have returned since Dad came back.
Yeah.
So again, there's an element of Ian as this sort of dark father, this sinister father figure. But there's also another sinister father figure off stage in her past.
Yes, because where's the dad been? And his coming back has initiated the fits. Has he been in prison? Does he abuse her? Question marks.
Yeah, it's a small but absolutely crucial part of the play.
Yeah, it's so subtly done.
And this is, again, things people miss in those early interpretations, because the violence and the abuse are the things that you see, but it's those small lines and small details that she provides that allow you later to suddenly think, oh, hang on, there's much more going on here.
And what do you think happens to her as the play goes on, and how does her character evolve? Because I would say that, as we said earlier, that none of these characters are as simple as you first assume. So she is not just the simple, vulnerable, abused girl.
No.
She actually grows from that, doesn't she?
She does. She's the survivor. It's Ian who is reduced to sort of cowering inside a child's grave. And she becomes harsher. There's that line where Ian is in the makeshift grave and she says, "You're sitting under a hole. You'll get wet." And she just calls him a stupid bastard. And that last stage direction, that she eats her fill of food first and then feeds Ian. So it's not a sentimental end of the play. It reminds me of the end of Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, where Jane Eyre comes back to the blinded Rochester, and "Reader, I married him" is not actually a happy ending. It's, "I'm going to get my own back on you for being a bigamist."
But there is something in her that she does care for him in the end as well.
Yes, she feeds him. And again, that's in the gift of the director and the actors playing it. How far do you make it? Do you make it a sentimental feeding? Or is she somehow, I don't know, is she keeping him alive just to torture him?
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, she's a survivor, so we admire her strength. She actually escapes, so she takes the initiative to escape. And then when it degenerates into what is essentially a war zone, it's described that out in the streets, if she leaves the hotel room, it's unsafe, soldiers are marauding. She goes in search of food, and it's clear that she has to give herself in sexual terms to a soldier in order to secure food, which she seems to have done, and comes back successfully with food. So she's surviving in harsh conditions in those terms.
Yeah. And interestingly, Kane flags up the fact that she's a vegetarian at the beginning of the play. And also she won't drink any of the champagne or the gin that Ian attempts to give her. Yet at the end of the play, she has brought back sausage and gin. So she's a pragmatist. So she goes through this journey of having a very sort of strict moral code to being a moral pragmatist at the end of the play.
Well, it's funny you said that, because you mentioned her being a vegetarian earlier, and I was a bit puzzled. What's the relevance of that? And I had missed it, of course. Well done for spotting that.
But again, it's something that is not immediately apparent when you first view the play.
I think it's interesting that Kane said about Kate, she was disturbed by what she created and what happened to her. Who wouldn't be? And she said, "How could I create such a beautiful woman in order for her to be so abused?" I thought that was very interesting, that she sees her as being beautiful, but that she also disavowed any suggestion that the play is about gender politics per se, just because Kate's a woman and is vulnerable. And in fact, of course, she becomes less vulnerable, as we've just described, as the play goes on. And Kane insisted that she was just addressing these as human problems, not related to gender per se.
I don't buy that at all. I think all of her plays are...
Okay.
Well, partly because she's so defensive about this issue. In an interview she did for a book called Rage and Reason, she rather contentiously says, "I don't believe there is such a thing as a female playwright. As you say, you write about just humankind." Yet all of her plays are very much about gender and toxic masculinity and abuse and sexual violence and coercion and control. And it's interesting that she disavows herself, I think, from that previous generation of playwrights, like Carol Churchill, April DeAngelis, Claire McIntyre.
She didn't want to align herself with these playwrights.
No, and I think that also causes a confusion from the critical response, because certainly early feminist theatre critics treated Kane with a lot of suspicion, quite rightly, because she seems to sort of disassociate herself from a feminist playwriting tradition. Yet I would argue she's absolutely part of that tradition, even though she wants to reject it. So it's interesting that she aligns herself with mainly male playwrights, that the figures she talks about admiring are Edward Bond, Harold Pinter, Howard Barker. So she aligns herself with a male tradition, if you like.
It's hard to escape an idea that it's male aggression and violence that's the issue in this play.
It is, it can't be denied. And it's there in almost every one of the other plays as well.
So I wanted to ask you a bit more about the graphic violence depicted in the play and how we should be responding to it or what we think about it. Critics largely, and people still would think that it's gratuitous, it's excessive. Is it a violent play or is it a play about violence? How do you think we should interpret the violence on display?
I mean, it is excessive. And it is unremitting, but it is a play about violence and possibly what causes it and the way that people themselves become victims of violence or trapped by violence. And also the fact that it's circular. The play ends with the fact that it doesn't end, hopefully, that they're in this refuge in the hotel room, but the war is still raging around them. So it's a play about the chaos that's unleashed through violence, but it's certainly not a play that glorifies violence.
You're absolutely right. It's absolutely not glamorizing. It's not like a Tarantino film, although it is artificial, right? So this is the point. The Tarantino film sort of revels in its artificiality to some degree, doesn't it? And we know it's not actually happening for real. Actually, weirdly, in the play, she would insist we're not looking at actual atrocities. We are imagining what's going on. And in fact, of course, they have to be because this is being acted, not done for real. For some reason, this becomes even more unsettling. How does that work? That's working on us in that way.
It's interesting that on the one hand, she shows Ian's sodomy by the soldier, but she doesn't show Kate's rape during the night. That takes place off stage. And she maintains that when Ian eats the baby, it's quite clear that it's a theatrical image. It's not real. Although there have been productions where it has been made more of a realistic act. It's interesting that in her next play, Phaedra's Love, the violence was staged very realistically. And when I went to see it at the Gate Theatre, it was a bit like a Jacobean Revenger's tragedy, where it was cartoon-like, and it didn't quite work.
I think it's interesting that in staging it less realistically, then really what we're focusing on is the impulse, what's causing people to behave like this rather than the act itself, in a sense. So we're thinking about where it comes from.
Yes.
And also, she obviously, of course, upends the context in which violence takes place. So this hotel room, as we said at the beginning, turns into somewhere that's not a place of romantic assignation. It's the reverse. And then we have a war going on in a hotel room, which is very unlikely, but the acts of war going on in a hotel room, not actually in war. So somehow putting them in this different context, we're forced to think of them differently. They come out more starkly even, rather than put them in a box labeled war and pass over them. It's okay because that's war. This isn't war. This is in a hotel room. So it makes you realize that this is all about the human instinct or impulse towards violence, not just what we actually do and what you see being done. And I guess that applies, does it not, Graham, to her treatment of rape or her view about rape as well? It's an interesting question about why present sexual violence, as you said she does in her other plays. What is it that she's seeking to understand or for us to take away about rape and sexual abuse?
Well, I think, again, it's this sort of the idea of the one act leading to much worse, if you want to put gradations on these things and whether you should indeed. But it's interesting that it's that act that triggers everything else in the play. And indeed, that act of rape is revisited on Ian himself. And indeed, far worse, he's also blinded and also made to come back from the dead. It's almost as if he is in sort of a state of purgatory at the end of the play.
She was asked, why does Ian want to rape Kate? And she says that she doesn't know why, it just turns him on. But she also defended the subject of rape and the question of where do these impulses come from, questioning whether it's culturally specific.
Yes.
She referred to the Vietnam War, that the Vietnamese and North Vietnamese, I don't know how true this is, but that they did not rape women in the Vietnam War, she said. But she cited it as a suggestion that somehow this has some source in the cultural models of sexual behavior.
Well, also the fact is Ian's misogyny as well. It's interesting that his wife has left him for another woman, and his fear of homosexuality, that fear of him being mistaken for an effeminate man by Kate at the beginning. And of course, the irony of that is that he undergoes a homosexual, well, not actually a homosexual rape. He's raped by the soldier because he wants to enact what happened to the soldiers on his girlfriend. But his fear of that is something that the soldier picks up on. Because he says he'd rather be killed than fucked, I think.
Yes, that's right. You mentioned earlier, and Ian ends up, as you say, possibly dying and coming back. It's unclear. But then you mentioned also earlier Kate saying that she believed in God. So I was interested in what you think is being said about faith and religion, Christianity in the play, given the bleakness of the events we witness and their lives and the state of the world. What do you think she's saying about religion and personal faith? Kate says, when Ian says that he would like to kill himself, Kate says, God wouldn't like it.
Yes.
And you're thinking, what? This doesn't look like a world where God's got much influence.
No, Kane has said in interviews that she was brought up as an evangelical Christian. She believed that the second coming would occur in her lifetime. And around the age of 21 or so, she lost that faith. But she says her relationship with God was a bit like her first relationship breakup. God and that impetus for belief is there in almost all of the plays. It's right at the end of her final play, 448, Psychosis. And it's there in Kate. It's interesting, in the first production at the Royal Court, in the second production, actually, when James MacDonald had a chance to redirect it when there was a revival in 2000, and he made a really interesting stage direction in that at the opening of the play, you have Kate exploring the hotel room while Ian is in the shower. So you see her taking out the drawers, looking around, and she finds a Gideon's Bible in one of the desks. And there's a moment where she actually sits down and starts reading it. But it's a lovely little moment, and that sets up the faith that she has. So she gives the baby a Christian burial. She says that prayer to the baby.
And she constructs a makeshift cross to stick into the floor of the hotel room where she buries the baby.
Absolutely, yes. And she goes to all that trouble. And she refutes Ian's nihilism, where he says, there's no God, there's no Father Christmas, there's no fucking Narnia, there's nothing.
Yes.
And she refutes that. And she talks actually about that scene with the gun as being very similar to Beckett's Endgame, where they both pray to God to see whether he exists, and he doesn't answer their prayers.
Yes.
It's a similar moment in Blasted where Ham says the bastard, he doesn't exist. Well, Kane rewrites that by Ian calling God a cunt.
Yes, it's Ham in Endgame, isn't it? The bastard, he doesn't exist. And Beckett got castigated for using the word bastard rather than the fact that he said God didn't exist.
Yes, yes.
It's an interesting part of Kate's characterization, and what we were saying earlier about her strength is that she continues to believe in some way. She wants to believe in an afterlife. She's determined, despite what Ian says. She says there's got to be something. It doesn't make sense otherwise. And of course, we're all looking for some sense. And one of the criticisms, I suppose, and one of the difficulties of the play, isn't it, Graham, is that it's hard to find a moral framework that we can latch on to that gives us any hope. Do you think that the play is largely amoral? Is there any suggestion that, there's something to hold on to in the face of all this desolation?
I don't know. I don't think it's an amoral play. I think it's not a didactic play. And I think that's the difference. It shows that there's a moral framework that if you actually transgress it in some way, as Ian does, there are consequences.
True.
But increasingly, by the time we get to a play like Cleansed, I think that this idea of love as a sort of, might even be rather naive, but it's the idea in that play where love survives outside of all of the brutality that we see.
Well, in this case, the ending, let's talk about the ending then, in a way where we're left in these terms is, in practical terms, their prospects are pretty grim.
Yes.
It's war out there. Ian is essentially helpless. Kate is on her own. Their survival is in question. However, do you think that what goes on between them, as we touched on earlier, is there something hopeful in what happens between them?
Yeah, and I think it's that thank you. It's that small moment of recognition from a man who has not said that throughout the play. He's never acknowledged an act of kindness from anyone else throughout the play. And there are those analogies with Edward Bond's Saved, where at the end of that play, you have the character of Len, who has witnessed the stoning of the baby, in which he is probably the father, mending a chair. And it seems a really small, insignificant act. But that thank you shows that there is some sort of connection there and possible hope for redemption in Ian. Of course, he's also someone who has actually shown that despite his lack of belief, he has died and he has come back to Earth.
Well, I think you're right, though. Whether you know that, whether you interpret that way or not, the simple act of her feeding him seems a sign of humanity, an ability to care about someone else that we just latch onto as potentially some flicker of hope.
Mm.
And she, of course, demonstrates, as we said earlier, some ability to survive, perhaps. So I guess it might be safe to say that this is not a play, Graham, that we would go to the theater to enjoy or be entertained by in the conventional way, unless one can find some form of enjoyment in the recognition of truth in effectively constructed art. I've always argued that. But she said herself that she hated the idea of theater as an evening pastime. It should be emotionally and intellectually demanding. So this is not an evening pastime. Why do you think we should venture out to see Blasted on the stage?
Well, I think because it is emotionally and intellectually demanding. It's theatrically demanding. One of the important things I think about Kane is that she restores a real sense of theatricality in all of her works, in highly theatrical, often in unexpected ways. And also it's a great demonstration of, it's a play that attracts, particularly in the roles of Ian and Kate, really fine roles. And it's attracted some really top flight actors. It's the play that does not get revived very often. Indeed, many of Kane's plays are not revived that often. And I suspect post-COVID, we're going to get big crowd-pleasing plays, I think.
It's funny because I think you would have thought that many of these plays are about the trials that we've been through in a way, and the world that's challenging. And I've always argued, I think it was D.S. Naipaul defended Hardy. Someone was criticizing Hardy for being pessimistic. And he said, it's not about pessimism or optimism, it's about truth. And Kane herself said, my only responsibility is to the truth, however awful the truth might be. And surely that's what we should be looking to art to do.
I'd agree, but whether the public mood is for that is debatable. It's a bit like Noel Coward writing that play after World War II, where he imagines the Germans actually winning. And it flopped because post-Second World War, we didn't want to see a play about the recent events.
I see your point. I mean, let's admit, it's a pretty hard sell, as you say. But she said she believed, essentially, I guess, in the cathartic power of theater, because sometimes we have to descend into hell imaginatively in order to avoid going there in reality. If we can experience something through art, then we might be able to change our future, because experience engraves lessons on our heart through suffering, whereas speculation leaves us untouched, which I think returns to her idea of experiential theater.
Yeah, and there's the moral framework of the play that encapsulate her moral view of not only theatre, but about art in general as well.
Yes, because her agent reacted to the criticism initially by going, you're missing the point. Clearly, Sarah Kane is pathologically anti-violence. You can't think that this is a play written in support of violence. It's the complete opposite.
Yeah.
Anyway, we've run past our time, Graham. I'm sorry to keep you so long, but it turns out this is a very rich play to talk about. Before I let you go, one of the traditions of the podcast is that I like to ask my guest if they could recommend another play that we could talk about in a future episode, or just that listeners could go and look out for, or see, or read. So do you have a personal favorite that you'd be happy to suggest?
Well, a relatively recent play that I'm very, very fond of is Ella Hickson's play, The Writer.
Yes.
It's a really interesting play about the wrongs of theatre. It's about a young female writer who meets a director and castigates him about everything that is wrong about British theatre. And his challenge to her is, I'm going to commission you to write a play. And it's about the compromises that the writer encounters despite herself, but also this utopian vision that she presents that is absolutely rejected by the figure of the director. I think it's an absolutely fascinating play.
Interesting. Obviously, this podcast is not often about the wrongs of theater, but it would be interesting if it's about the compromises required to write for theater. Certainly, I guess we would take away that Sarah Kane was not much subject to the compromises.
No, she was uncompromising.
To her credit, of course.
To her credit, absolutely.
Graham, thank you so much for your time and your expertise. It's been a great pleasure meeting you and learning more about Sarah Kane and Blasted.
And vice versa. Thank you very much, Douglas.
As the curtain falls on the blasted ruins of the hotel room and the wounded figures of Ian and Kate clinging to life, are we repulsed by the events we've witnessed? Aggrieved at the assault this playwright has subjected us to? Do we despair at human depravity and the world's prospects? Perhaps, but we may also just recognize some small comfort in the need the characters retain for love and the compulsion to give it, no matter what extremists they suffer. This, and the cathartic consolations of art, may be antidotes to the brutalities that life may inflict upon us. Thanks for listening. See you next time.
Thanks for listening. To listen to other episodes, to find out news about future episodes, or to leave comments about what you've heard, please visit us at www.theplaypodcast.com. You can also follow us on Facebook or on Twitter at theplaypod. You're also welcome to email plays@theplaypodcast.com to suggest plays that we could talk about in future episodes. You can also register your suggestion on the website. Thanks again, and see you next time.